In the lab video, you just witnessed a dollar being set on fire without burning up. That fire was both bright and hot, yet the dollar bill was not consumed. In this video lesson, I'm going to explain to you how the burning money lab works on the molecular level so that you understand how the properties of matter, both chemical and physical properties, were at play during this lab, and how the properties of matter prevented the dollar bill from lighting on fire. So we're going to look at the individual substances that were used in this lab. Dollar bills aren't really printed on paper. I think more accurately we would say that dollar bills are printed on cloth. The paper that makes up dollar bills is mostly cotton and linen, both of which are made up primarily of a substance known as cellulose. These long chain molecules are cellulose molecules. And cellulose is a type of sugar that plants make, but it's not like the sweet sugars that you're used to eating. These are long fibrous sugars that make up the structure of the plant's cells, cellulose. Now, these fibrous sugar molecules can light on fire if you get them hot enough. These particles, remember, are solids, so they're vibrating in a fixed place. And if you can get them to vibrate so fast that their bonds can no longer hold together and they release their bonds, then the fabric of the dollar bill would actually start to burn. And that's very, very possible to do. However, it's much more difficult to burn cotton and linen fibers than it is to burn printer paper fibers. Those are a lot more accessible to the air. There's less moisture interwoven within the fibers of like printer paper, and therefore printer paper burns much more easily than cotton or linen. So that's the first little trick of this lab demo, is that the type of paper that dollar bills are made out of doesn't burn all that easily to begin with. Here's the second substance that we used in the lab, and this was a liquid substance. Notice that here I have water molecules. Those water molecules are surrounding isopropyl alcohol molecules. Those are the ones with 3 carbons, 8 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. And the alcohol is dissolved in the water. The alcohol is completely surrounded and evenly mixed in the water molecules. These particles are all sliding past one another, and it's important to note that these substances are sticking to the outside of the dollar bill. Now, here's the first time in the lab that chemical properties come into play. We know that isopropyl alcohol is a flammable substance, and flammability is a chemical property because it talks about how a substance will react with another substance to change its bonds. In this case, the isopropyl alcohol will react violently with oxygen, and the isopropyl alcohol will change the way that it's bonded if the oxygen molecules combine with it. So here's our freely moving oxygen gas on the outside. The particles are just moving freely wherever. Those oxygen molecules will combine with the isopropyl alcohol molecules if there's enough heat present. And that's what we did when we lit the match. We added energy to the system that allowed a chemical change to happen. And the chemical change that happened was the isopropyl alcohol. Watch those molecules with the black carbons in them. Those isopropyl alcohol molecules reacted with the oxygen in the air, and we didn't have isopropyl alcohol anymore. It burned up. It changed its bonds and became an entirely different substance. And because the bonds changed and it's a different substance, that was a chemical change. Now notice the water is still there. The cellulose is still there. Those didn't undergo a chemical change. Only the isopropyl alcohol burned up. First off, you'll notice that there's all these new molecules at the top of the screen. Carbon dioxide molecules, which are 1 black carbon bonded to 2 red oxygens. And now those particles are all moving around freely in the air around the dollar bill. But here's the other thing you need to know. When a chemical reaction like this happens and one substance changes to an entirely different substance, there's a lot of energy that's released. Now at this point, the air around the dollar bill ceases to be important anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of that from the picture. It's going to freely float away because those particles are just freely moving. They're not actually going to impact the rest of this explanation. But here's the thing, that energy that was released as the alcohol burn could have gone into the dollar bill and caused those cellulose molecules to start vibrating really fast and break apart and release their energy, which would cause other molecules to break apart and release their energy. It could have burned the paper that made up the dollar bill. So why didn't it? Why didn't that energy light the paper of the dollar bill on fire? Well, here's what happened. That energy didn't make it to the dollar bill. It was actually absorbed by the water molecules that were still coating the outside of the dollar bill, and those water molecules started to move much faster than they were before. Because the water molecules started moving faster, they sort of absorbed the blow for the cellulose molecules. So the cellulose molecules didn't really absorb all that much energy at all. They clearly didn't absorb enough energy to start breaking their bonds so that the actual paper part of the dollar bill would light on fire. So how is it that water molecules are able to absorb that energy without allowing it to get to the dollar bill? We have to look at some of the properties of water in order to understand that. Now, what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at the chemical and physical properties that happen throughout this lab demo. First of all, there was a chemical change that happened as the isopropyl alcohol bonds broke and the oxygen gas bonds in the air broke, and then new bonds formed to make carbon dioxide gas, a different gas, and water vapor, a different gas. And those new substances were formed, energy was released, and that energy went somewhere. It went into the water on the outside of the bill. There were also some physical changes that happened. The key one is that energy was added to the water and heated it up, and some of that water on the outside of the dollar bill did evaporate and become a gas. If you did this at home, you probably noticed that the dollar bill was much drier after the reaction compared to before the reaction. It wasn't completely dry, but it was much drier than it was at the beginning. But none of these things really explain why the dollar bill didn't light on fire. Why was it that the dollar bill was safe from burning? We have to look at the physical properties of water to understand it. First of all, water has a pretty big density, a density of 1, which doesn't sound that big, but it really is quite big for a molecular substance like water. And here's what that means. Because the density of water was big, there were a lot of molecules packed onto the outside of the dollar bill. There was a lot of water available to absorb energy because there were just a lot of water molecules there. Here's another thing that's really important to know about water. It is not a good conductor of heat. You've probably noticed this if you're ever really extremely hungry and you tried to make macaroni and cheese on your stove and it took the water forever to boil. Water can absorb a lot of heat before it actually heats up and changes temperature a great deal. Water is not a good conductor, so therefore the water didn't conduct the energy from the reaction that happened to the dollar bill very well. Instead, the water absorbed that energy itself. And then finally, there's one more property that caused this reaction to play out the way that it did, and it's that isopropyl alcohol is highly soluble in water. You saw in the picture that the isopropyl alcohol molecules were completely surrounded by water molecules. It wasn't like the isopropyl alcohol was clinging directly to the dollar bill, so when it reacted and released heat, that heat was right next to the dollar. Instead, that heat was very well contained and surrounded by water molecules. So the water molecules had a great opportunity to absorb that energy from the reaction as it was being released. Hopefully, these properties, both chemical and physical, help you to understand exactly what happened in this lab. It was because the water was coating the dollar bill that even though a lot of energy was released as the isopropyl alcohol burned, The water was able to absorb that energy and heat up without allowing the dollar bill to heat up enough to start on fire.